In the concealed chambers of the alchemical laboratory, where base metals awaited their transmutation and philosophers labored over furnaces that burned with meanings far exceeding their visible flames, there existed a peculiar instruction that appeared in text after text, encoded in layers of deliberate obscurity. The king must die. Not the literal monarch who ruled kingdoms of earth and stone, but another sovereign entirely, one who governed with absolute authority over the interior landscape of the human psyche. The alchemists, speaking in their characteristic cipher of metals and operations, were describing something that would not receive its proper psychological articulation until the 20th century. The solar ego, that luminous tyrant of consciousness, must undergo its own crucifixion before any genuine transformation can occur. This figure appears throughout the alchemical corpus with startling consistency. In the Rosarium Philosophorum, the king drowns in the philosophical sea. In the Aurora Consurgens, he is devoured by the dark waters of the unconscious. The Splendor Solis depicts him entering the bath of purification, surrendering his crown and scepter. Always, the message remains constant. The ruling principle of consciousness, the structure that has maintained order and identity, must be voluntarily sacrificed. What the medieval adepts understood, and what Carl Jung would later elaborate through his doctrine of individuation, is that the ego, particularly in its inflated, solar aspect, represents both the necessary foundation of psychological development and the primary obstacle to its completion. The paradox cuts to the very heart of the transformative work. We must use the ego to transcend the ego, employ the very structure that must be sacrificed as the instrument of its own dissolution. The solar ego emerges naturally in the course of human development, a necessary crystallization of consciousness from the oceanic undifferentiation of infancy. It is the I that separates from the not I, the center of awareness that allows us to navigate the world with coherence and purpose. In its healthy manifestation, the ego serves as the organizing principle of the personality, the executive function that mediates between inner impulses and outer demands. It establishes boundaries, maintains continuity of identity, and provides the sense of agency required for effective action in the world. Without this structure, we would remain dissolved in unconscious participation mystique, unable to differentiate ourselves from our environment or from the collective. Yet this same structure, left unchallenged and unexamined, becomes what the alchemists symbolized as the Rex Superbus, the arrogant king who mistakes his partial dominion for absolute sovereignty. The solar ego, so named because it identifies itself with consciousness itself, begins to believe that it constitutes the totality of the psyche. It mistakes its spotlight of awareness for the whole theater of being, its narrow beam of directed attention for the vast darkness that surrounds and contains it. This inflation is not pathological in any conventional sense. It is the natural consequence of the ego's necessary functions. To maintain coherence, the ego must exclude vast territories of experience. To make decisions, it must prioritize certain values and repress others. To construct a stable identity, it must identify with certain qualities and reject their opposites. The problem emerges when this provisional arrangement hardens into permanent architecture, when the ego forgets that it is a function rather than a substance, a perspective rather than a totality. The false king rules through a particular strategy of consciousness that Jung termed one-sidedness. The solar ego achieves its clarity and brilliance precisely through exclusion, through saying, "This is me and that is not me," with increasing rigidity. In its desperate attempt to maintain control and predictability, it wages constant warfare against anything that threatens its supremacy. The body with its unruly desires, the emotions with their overwhelming intensities, the imagination with its strange visions, the instincts with their animal wisdom, all must be subordinated to the rational will of the sovereign. This is the tyranny that masquerades as strength, the rigidity that mistakes itself for integrity. The alchemists depicted this condition through the image of the sick king, the Rex Agrotus, who requires healing through the philosophical medicine. He sits on his throne, displaying all the regalia of power, while secretly consumed by an interior corruption. His kingdom appears ordered and prosperous from without, yet beneath the surface, the waters of the unconscious are rising. The repressed contents accumulate pressure. The denied aspects of the self gather force in the darkness. What the ego has refused to integrate begins to organize itself into autonomous complexes, shadow formations that possess their own intelligence and agency. The king, in his solar isolation, becomes increasingly brittle, his sovereignty maintained only through greater and greater expenditure of psychic energy in the service of repression. This is the condition that precipitates the alchemical crisis, what the texts describe as the mortificatio or death of the king. In psychological terms, it manifests as the moment when the ego's defensive strategies begin to fail, when the carefully constructed personality structure can no longer contain the energies it has denied. This may arrive through external catastrophe, the loss of a relationship, the collapse of a career, the confrontation with mortality. Or it may emerge from within as a kind of existential exhaustion, a recognition that the life one has constructed, however successful by conventional measures, lacks authentic vitality. The solar ego, for all its brightness, has been burning on fuel stolen from the deeper self. When those reserves are depleted, the structure begins to collapse. Jung understood this crisis as the essential precondition for individuation, the process through which the personality moves from ego-centeredness to self-realization. But he was equally clear about the terror this transition entails. The ego experiences its necessary relativization as annihilation. To surrender its identification with the totality of consciousness feels like death itself, because from the ego's perspective, nothing exists beyond its own boundaries. The darkness that surrounds its small circle of light appears as absolute void rather than the pleroma from which consciousness originally emerged and to which it must periodically return for renewal. This is why the alchemists insisted that the work requires courage beyond the merely physical. The adept must be willing to undergo a death that is not biological but ontological, a dissolution of the very structure through which the world has been apprehended and navigated. The sacrifice demanded is not suicide but surrender, not the destruction of the ego but its dethronement. The solar principle must recognize that it rules only a small province within a vast kingdom, that its daylight consciousness represents one mode of knowing among many. This recognition cannot be merely intellectual. It must be lived through the terrible descent that the alchemists termed the nigredo, the blackening phase where all certainties dissolve. In this darkness, the ego discovers that the qualities it projected onto others as shadow contain vital energies required for wholeness. The aggression it denied contains necessary assertiveness. The chaos it feared contains creative potential. The irrationality it repressed contains intuitive wisdom. The weakness it despised contains authentic vulnerability and the capacity for relationship. The philosophical death of the solar ego occurs in stages, each with its particular ordeal. First comes the recognition of shadow, the confrontation with those aspects of self that the ego has designated as not me. This alone requires heroism of a high order, for it means acknowledging that the enemy we have fought externally lives within, that the qualities we most despise in others are precisely those we have refused to own in ourselves. But shadow integration, difficult as it is, represents only the beginning. Beyond the personal shadow lies the encounter with the anima or animus, those contrasexual aspects of the psyche that carry the projections of soul and spirit. Here the ego must surrender its identification with the persona, the social mask it has mistaken for its true face, and encounter the inner figure who represents everything excluded by that external presentation. The third death, and perhaps the most devastating, involves the recognition of the self, that greater center and circumference of the personality of which the ego is merely one expression. This encounter shatters the ego's presumption of sovereignty absolutely, for it reveals that what we call I is a partial and temporary crystallization within a much vaster wholeness. The ego discovers itself to be, in Jung's language, a complex among complexes, distinguished from others by its continuity and position at the threshold of consciousness, but not fundamentally different in kind. This recognition brings both humiliation and liberation. Humiliation because the ego must abandon its inflation, liberation because it can finally cease the exhausting effort to be everything and can instead assume its proper function as mediator between conscious and unconscious. The alchemical texts describe this transition through the symbolism of the philosophical marriage, the conjunctio oppositorum, where king and queen, sun and moon, conscious and unconscious, enter into union. But this marriage can occur only after the death of the old king, only after the solar ego has been dissolved in the waters of the unconscious and reconstituted on a new basis. What emerges from this process is not the destruction of ego consciousness, but its transformation. The ego that survives the work, and Jung insisted that a strong ego is required to withstand the transformative process, no longer claims absolute sovereignty. It becomes instead what the alchemists termed the servus rubeus, the red servant who mediates between the demands of outer reality and the depths of inner necessity. This transformed ego possesses a quality fundamentally different from its solar predecessor. It has learned to listen. Where the old ego commanded and controlled, the new ego observes and responds. It has developed what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension between opposites without prematurely resolving them into one-sided solutions. It can tolerate ambiguity, paradox and uncertainty because it no longer requires the absolute clarity that comes only through exclusion. Most crucially, it has established a relationship with the self, that greater wholeness that transcends ego consciousness while including it. The ego becomes an organ of perception for the self, rather than mistaking itself for the totality of being. The practical manifestations of this transformation are subtle but profound. The individual who has undergone the death and resurrection of the solar ego displays a quality that can only be called authenticity, not in the superficial sense of self-expression, but as a fundamental alignment between conscious intention and unconscious necessity. Such a person has integrated enough shadow material to be relatively free of compulsive projection. They can see others with decreased distortion because they have reclaimed the energy previously expended in denying their own depths. They possess what the alchemists called the philosophical gold, which is nothing other than the capacity to be fully present to whatever arises, whether it conforms to the ego's preferences or not. This does not produce perfection, but wholeness, and the distinction is absolute. The perfected ego seeks to eliminate all that contradicts its ideal image. The whole individual has learned to contain contradiction, to be simultaneously strong and vulnerable, assertive and receptive, rational and intuitive. They display what Jung termed psychological sophistication, not the sophistication of the intellectual who knows many things, but the wisdom of one who has descended into their own depths and emerged bearing the treasure of hard-won self-knowledge. They have learned that the light of consciousness depends upon darkness to give it meaning, that the ego's vitality depends upon its ongoing dialogue with the unconscious from which it emerged. Yet this transformation brings its own burdens, ones that the alchemists encoded in their warnings about the loneliness of the adept. The individual who has sacrificed the solar ego can no longer participate unconsciously in collective identifications. They cannot seek refuge in the mass movements, the simplifying ideologies, the comforting certainties that the unreflective ego clings to. They have seen too much, integrated too much, to retreat into the sunny shallows of collective consciousness. This is not spiritual superiority, but existential solitude, the necessary condition of one who has individuated enough to stand as themselves rather than as a representative of collective values. They must bear the tension of opposites consciously rather than projecting it onto external enemies. They must live with complexity rather than seeking the clarity that comes through one-sidedness. The sacrifice of the solar ego also means surrendering certain kinds of power. The individual who can no longer identify exclusively with consciousness, who has learned to recognize the autonomous activity of the unconscious, cannot claim the absolute control that the unreflective ego takes for granted. They must acknowledge that much of what occurs within their psyche happens beyond their conscious direction, that dreams bring messages they did not compose, that emotions arise they did not summon, that insights emerge they cannot claim as personal achievements. This is the humility that authenticity requires, not false modesty, but accurate recognition of the limited scope of ego consciousness within the larger economy of the psyche. The alchemical tradition insists, however, that this sacrifice, painful as it is, represents the only path to genuine transformation. The solar ego cannot evolve. It can only be transcended. Its very structure, based on exclusion and control, prevents the integration of the opposites required for wholeness. The false king must die so that the true sovereign, the self, can assume its rightful position. This is not the destruction of consciousness, but its expansion, not the elimination of the ego, but its relativization within a larger context. The individual consciousness that emerges from this death and rebirth no longer mistakes itself for the whole, but neither does it diminish its importance. It becomes instead what it was always meant to be, the indispensable intermediary between the vast unconscious and the demands of external reality, the bridge across which energies flow in both directions. The contemporary implications of this alchemical psychology deserve careful consideration, for we live in an era of unprecedented ego inflation. The modern world, with its emphasis on individual achievement, self-actualization, and personal empowerment, has produced solar egos of remarkable strength and equally remarkable one-sidedness. We are encouraged to know what we want, to pursue our goals with unwavering determination, to craft our lives according to conscious intention. These are not false values, but they become destructive when pursued with no recognition of the darkness that contains and balances the light. The result is a culture of exhausted strivers, brilliant achievers who have constructed impressive external lives while remaining estranged from their own depths. The alchemical solution, the willing sacrifice of the false king, offers not escape from achievement, but its recontextualization. The ego that has died and been reborn can still pursue goals, but it does so in dialogue with the unconscious rather than in tyranny over it. It listens for what wants to emerge rather than imposing its will without reflection. It recognizes symptoms, anxiety, depression, compulsions, not as enemies to be conquered, but as messages from denied aspects of self-demanding integration. This approach requires more courage than the solar ego's strategy of domination, for it means living with uncertainty, following a path that cannot be fully mapped in advance, trusting processes that operate beyond conscious control. The texts speak of the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone that represents the goal of the great work. This stone possesses paradoxical properties. It is both the beginning and end of the work. It heals all diseases, yet is found in the most despised places. It is common as dirt, yet more precious than gold. Jung identified this symbolic object with the self in its full realization, the integrated totality of conscious and unconscious, the reconciliation of all opposites. But the stone can be found only through the death of the solar ego, only through the willing sacrifice of the false sovereignty that prevents the recognition of what has been there all along. This brings us to the profound truth encrypted in the alchemical maxim. Gold is not made, but revealed. The transformation the adept sought was not the manufacture of something new, but the uncovering of what was always present, but hidden beneath layers of repression and identification. The true gold of the personality, its authentic vitality, its unique essence, its particular contribution to the wholeness of being, cannot be constructed by the ego's willful efforts. It can only be discovered through the ego's surrender, through its willingness to die to its false sovereignty and be reborn as servant to the greater self. The solar ego, brilliant and necessary as it is, represents the provisional identity we construct to navigate the world. But it is not who we are. Beneath its bright surface lies the dark matter of the unconscious, those denied energies and repressed potentials that contain the very vitality the ego seeks. The false king must die so that authentic kingship, grounded not in inflation but in integration, not in control but in conscious relationship with the unconscious, can emerge. This is the sacrifice the work demands, the death that leads to resurrection, the necessary crucifixion of the partial self so that the whole being can incarnate. In the silent laboratory of the interior, where the philosophical work unfolds beyond the reach of external observation, the solar ego approaches its necessary crisis. The choice, which is no choice at all for one who has glimpsed what lies beyond the ego's circumference, is between continuing the exhausting tyranny of one-sided consciousness or surrendering to the transformative darkness that contains the seeds of wholeness. The alchemist knew what depth psychology would later confirm. The gold we seek is not created by the ego's heroic efforts, but discovered through its willing sacrifice. The king must die so that the kingdom, the full inheritance of the integrated psyche, can finally be claimed. The treasure you seek is not in the maintenance of the solar throne, but in the courage to descend from it, to enter the darkness where all false sovereignty dissolves, and to be reborn as what you always were beneath the crown, whole, conscious, and radiantly, terribly alive.